This is Gareth Aden, and I am here for the Historical Committee of the Nashville Bar Association in its Oral History Project. This is April the 13th, 2017, and it's my pleasure today to be taking the history of a member of a noted family of Nashville attorneys. This is Jim Lackey III. Jim, good afternoon.
Afternoon, Gareth.
Could you give us your full name, please, sir?
My full name is James G. Lackey III.
And what's your birth date, please?
I was born August 9, 1943.
And I know from our discussion a while ago that you were born in Galveston, Texas. Is that right?
That's right.
How did that come to be?
Well, considering that I have been in Nashville all of my life, that might be a good question. My father was born here in Nashville. During the war, he was in the U.S. Navy, and during that period he was stationed in Galveston, Texas. One of his closest friends in the Navy so happened to have a young sister who in Galveston. In other words, my father's friend actually lived there in the same town where the ship was docked. Got my dad date with his little sister, and they hit it off, got engaged, and were married just several months after that in 1942. And by the time I was born, my father had shipped out and was in the North Atlantic, and only learned of my birth by ship-to-ship signal light. So that's not too common.
And your daddy was James G. Lackey, Jr., is that correct?
That's correct.
Tell me a little bit about your mother's family and what her name was. And
My mother was Mary Ellen Smith. Her father was a marine engineer. He worked for Bay Towing Company in Galveston, Texas, and was in charge of all of the engineering and of the tugboat fleet in Galveston. And my mother, in fact, and I were born in the same hospital in Galveston, and we visited many times back and forth. I have many childhood memories of visiting back and forth in Galveston and Lamarck, which is a few miles away where my grandparents finally settled.
Your dad was not the first, James Lackey, who was a lawyer in Nashville. Tell us about your grandfather.
My grandfather, James G. Sr., known as Gill, was born in 1988 in a small town in West Kentucky, and migrated to Nashville shortly after the turn of the century. Graduated from Vanderbilt Law School in 1910 and practiced law in Nashville throughout his career. In 1921, he started teaching contracts at the YMCA Night Law School, and taught there until after World War II, when he was asked to participate in the war trials in Japan, and went to Tokyo in 1947 to participate in that as actually defense counsel. However, he became ill over there, and shortly after returning to Nashville in 1949, he passed away.
Now, he then was the first member of your family to be a teacher at the YMCA Night Law School.
That's correct. And so when he left for his appointment in Tokyo, my father, having come back after the war and moved his young family to Nashville, and had taken up practice here in town. He took over temporarily teaching the contracts class that my grandfather had taught. And then when my grandfather passed away, my father took that on as a permanent position.
And I believe, because this was true when I was a young lawyer here in Nashville, your father's name is roughly synonymous with the YMCA Night Law School, and he became a dean there.
He did. In 1955, he took on the additional responsibility of dean of the school, all the time continuing to teach contracts, and continued on teaching contracts and serving as dean of the school until September of 1986, which is when he retired. And unfortunately, did not, I'll say he was 71 at that time. He did not live to see his 72nd birthday. So I think in many ways it's kind of illustrative of how much the teaching and the practice of law just was what energized him and just kept him going.
Precisely. Let's loop back now and talk about you for a while. Tell me about your early years, and particularly where you went to grade school.
I started in grade school at Julia Green Grammar School here in Nashville, in Green Hills, in 1949, which was the year, in fact, that Julia Green first opened as a brand new public school, and went through all 8 years there at Julia Green. And
where did your family live, Jim?
We lived at 4310 Sneed Road, which is just about a block and a half from the school. So once I was old enough to do so, I would walk or ride my bicycle. I never rode a school bus in my life.
Exactly. Then after Julia Green, where did you go?
After that, I went to Montgomery Bell Academy through the 9th through the 12th grade. And
what was that experience like?
It was just one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. I was, quite honestly, I had never anticipated going to MBA. I had always expected to be going to Hillsborough, where most of my classmates went. My father was very stern. He said, you know, it's really important to get a good college preparatory education. We think you need to go to MBA. I said, I want to go to Hillsborough with my friends.
Exactly.
Said, look, he said, we'll compromise. I'll give you 2 choices. You can go to MBA or BGA. And I said, what? So I said, I don't want to take a bus to Franklin's, so I'll go to MBA. Well, with that less than enthusiastic start, it just became just an absolute wonderful experience. I mean, to this day, some of my very best friends are the folks that I met there. The teachers were wonderful.
What were your years at MBA?
I was at MBA from 1957 to 1961.
And tell me a little bit about the people, the teachers that you recall that meant a lot to you.
Well, there were so many good teachers. I'd have to, the one that probably stands out more than ever was our senior English teacher, Ms. Lowry. She took care of her boys. She wanted them to be ready for class. She wanted them to be ahead of other freshmen where they went to college. And every class she would start off by telling us to, now boys, get organized. And to this day, I associate her with that and try to remember to follow that instruction.
Well, I know myself from going there what she was like, and she really was an extraordinary teacher. Anyone else, Jim, from the MBA years,
well,
classmates or teachers?
I did. I played sports, particularly football and track, and in both cases, Coach Tommy Owen was a great role model and an inspiration. He was very He's soft-spoken, but very firm, very knowledgeable, and every young man at MBA that ever served under him had a great deal of respect for him.
How did you do in classes? Did you do pretty well?
I would say I was above average, but not a class leader. I was in the top half of my class, but considering the quality of my fellow students, I'm pretty proud of that.
You mentioned some sports, and I believe you told me that your track team set a record at MBA.
We did. My particular event was the 880, and in particular on the 2-mile relay team. I ran the anchor leg of that, and my senior year we broke the school record at the district meet for the 2-mile relay. So that was a fun experience.
In between school years in the summertime, any jobs that you had or things that happened then that were memorable?
Well, I always worked when I was in the summer. I mostly worked on the county roads or the city roads, which was perhaps not a spectacular job, but I was awfully proud to be able to be earning a couple of dollars an hour. One thing that I did, that, and we'll refer to this again later, Tom Shriver. Tom Shriver was well known in town in later years. He got his start in law as a young attorney in my father's law office, and therefore I became friendly with him. So one time he started a little venture where he rented some property north of the business district downtown, and used it for parking, and he hired me to be his parking lot attendant. So I spent the summer doing that. I'd take my summer reading from MBA with me and read.
Ms. Lowry always had several
That's
books
right.
lined up for
That's
you to
right.
read. All right, it's now about 1961. You're graduating from your 4 years at MBA. What were your thoughts about college?
Well, I pretended to be interested in other colleges, but in reality, I always had wanted to go to Vanderbilt because of my father and grandfather both being Vanderbilt graduates, as well as some other cousins. And so I really set my sights on that, and in fact did attend Vanderbilt from '61 and graduating in 1965.
Did you join a fraternity?
I joined a fraternity. I was a member of Beta Theta Pi, and met a lot of friends during that period. I was officer of the fraternity at various different semesters. And
were there any of your friends, while you were an undergraduate at Vanderbilt, who later became attorneys here in Nashville?
There were some of those who I believe are still members of the bar here. Jimmy Cheshire, Aubrey Harwell, Weldon White. Those come to mind. Lionel Barrett, as a matter of fact.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. What about classes, and what areas did you sort of gravitate towards during college?
I was always interested in history. I majored in history, and minored in political science. Those were the courses that I really had the most interest in.
I know that you've already mentioned your work with the fraternity and having an office there. Were there other interests or things during your undergraduate years that were notable? Or
Two of the summers that I was in school, I worked for the National Park Service at Mount Rainier National Park, just southeast of Seattle. My purpose in going that direction primarily being to have an opportunity to attend the 1962 World's Fair in Seattle.
oh, neat. Yeah.
So really those were very important summers because it just gave me a great appreciation for the outdoors and nature, and I've always been a great supporter of the preservation and conservation since then, and made quite a few friends from other college folks like myself that had come from different parts of the country, and some of which are still friends today. In fact, one odd thing, just before our interview while I was sitting in this conference room, I got a call from one of those very friends that I met at Mount Rainier in 1962. We're still friends.
That's really fabulous. Did you ever climb Mount Rainier?
I wanted to. That's a good question, Gareth. They had expeditions to do that, and at my age, I was not able to do it without parental permission. So I made arrangements for that, and I asked my parents to give permission. They said, absolutely not. No way. So now Mount Rainier is 14,400 feet high. It's the third highest peak in the continental U.S. And they're at the 9,000 foot level. They have a camp. They call it Camp Muir, which is the overnight point where the summit climbers attain the first day, and then early before dawn they take off from there to mount the summit. Myself and some others did climb to Camp Muir, which is about the 9,000 foot level, and so that's as high as I got, but I almost had a chance to climb the summit.
Doing a little climbing myself, I know that it's a very dangerous mountain to climb because of the weather can turn on a dime.
And it did. And that day that we went up to Camp Muir, beautiful sunny day, turned into a darkened, foggy day, and had we not had an experienced climber with us, we would not have been able to even find our way back to the starting point.
Yeah. Jim, I think we've gotten to 1965, and you're graduating from undergraduate school.
Right.
And kind of tell us what your thoughts were and what you decided to do.
Well, of course, all of us as college students think a lot about what are we going to do when we get out, and I was no different. Being in a family with lawyers, that I thought, probably I would go to law school, and so I applied to Vanderbilt and entered Vanderbilt Law School in September.
How did that go?
Well, as it turned out, I was not motivated for any more studying. I soon found out that I just, some of the courses were interesting, but I just did not have the interest in studying and spending more time in class, and finished out the year, but I told my father, I said, don't think I'm mentally motivated to do this. So
How did he take that?
he was disappointed, but he had never encouraged me to go to law school either. He had been neutral on that to begin with. Of course, this was not the best time to be leaving school. This is 1966 now, which was in the big build-up for the Vietnam War. So having left school, I knew what was coming. So,
Yeah.
and I faced that. I decided, well, if I'm going to the military, I'd like to do that on my own terms. So I decided I'd rather be an officer, and I made the rounds of the recruiting stations, different services, to see what the best plan was, and ended up enlisting in the Army OCS program.
Tell us now that we would be in the fall, I guess, of 1966 when you're
That's
joining.
right.
What was the routine? Where were you stationed? And tell us about that.
Well, let me first say that the very first day that I reported for duty in Fort Dix, I called home, and my parents said, well, guess what? You just got your draft notice. You just got out of Dodge in time. So, answering your question, I was originally stationed at Fort Dix, New Jersey. Then Fort McClellan, Alabama, and then OCS at Fort Eustis, Virginia. And that's where I completed my 23 weeks of officer training and got my commission.
And where did the Army send young Jim Lackey?
Well, strangely, Gareth, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, 55 miles from home. So that was interesting. I could drive home and be with my family, or in some cases actually go on a date or something, drive back and be on post the next day. But my duty there was as a young training officer in a basic training company, training basic recruits. It was their first exposure to the military. So I progressed from training officer to battalion operations officer, and finally to company commander of one of the basic training units there.
So I guess because you were proficient at being an officer, you ended up serving the service by preparing young men for duty.
That's right. Myself and quite a number other of the junior officers there spent their entire military commitment at Fort Campbell training other folks, because the military wanted to have some stability in that training command. So, so I served in the military from '66 to '69. Got out in August of '69.
Looking back, what impact did that 3 years of service in the Army have on you?
Oh, I think it had quite an impact. I think it gave me much more of a broader world view of life, associating with so many different people from so many walks of life, and it was certainly sobering because of the importance of it. There was a lot going on in the country politically at that time. In fact, I was there at Fort Campbell when Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, and I had just started on a 3-day pass, and everyone was called back to post, and we had mandatory riot training, and were on alert for moving out to Memphis at any time. Turned out that wasn't needed, but it certainly was indicative of the volatility of the period.
I know you wouldn't mention this if I didn't ask you, but at the end of your service for the Army, I believe you were awarded, weren't you?
I did get awarded the Army Commendation Medal for my service at that time.
We're now, I guess, Jim, well, was there anyone in the service, by the way, who had any impact that you'd like to mention on your career or the trajectory of your life?
Well, my first commander when I was there, when I was training officers, a second lieutenant, he was a serious career military officer, and he did sort of take me under his wing and try to kind of show me the ropes of what it was like to be an officer, and I was always appreciative of that.
The fall of 1969. You've now done your duty to the country. What did you decide to do?
Well, came back to Nashville and ready to get back into the swing of life. I took a position in the training program, the officer training program, I guess you'd call it, at First American National Bank. And spent a little time at a branch, and then was assigned to the trust department.
Very interesting. Who did you work with there?
A lot of wonderful people there in the trust department that I work with. I particularly recall Brandon Huddleston.
Yeah.
Was a member of the bar and a long-time trust officer there. That was sort of my mentor, and my role was handling estates and trust, and I do particularly remember an early occasion when I had messed up something, was very upset with myself, and had talked to him about writing this situation. And I found him to be very matter-of-fact about it. And he said, "Jim, don't worry about it." He said, "When you stop making mistakes, you stop learning." And I was so appreciative that he could find a positive spin on that. But I've always remembered that and tried never to make the same mistake again. Remember from your mistakes.
Well, I don't think anyone has practiced wills and estates in Nashville that didn't remember Brandon Huddleston from that period. So you're working with lawyers.
Working with a number of lawyers and really becoming enmeshed in trust and estate law, and
did that
got me
make
more and
you
more
interested the
Yes.
law school?
Yes, it did. I became more and more interested in continuing that law education, and after giving that careful thought, I enrolled in the YMCA night law school while I was there in the trust department. And the nice thing about that is, having just recently gotten out of the military, I was able to use my GI benefits to pay the tuition.
Yes. But did you have to take contracts from your dad who was teaching there?
Good point. One of the advantages was that I had already had credits for one full year at Vanderbilt Law School, so I was able to transfer those credits, one of the courses being contracts. So I did not have to take the contracts course under my father, which I'm told by others was a course that failed a number of would-be students.
How did you do at the Y Law School? I guess you had, what, about 2 or 3 years that you had left in school?
Well, the program there is 4 years.
Yes.
And so I basically had fulfilled 1 year, so I had 3 to complete there instead of 4. But I did very well. It was all the difference in the world, being truly interested and motivated, and now enjoying the classes and really seeing how that would all fit together and sort of finding my real niche in that.
You know, it's always fun to ask attorneys about law professors, because invariably there's 1 or 2 that really had an influence. How about you?
Well, there was certainly a lot of good instructors there, and I possibly because I had now had a good bit of experience in wills and estates, I enjoyed Tyree Harris's wills course and Harlan Dodson's estate course. But I don't want to diminish any other instructors. I mean, I really enjoyed most of the classes.
Was Judge Henry Todd teaching?
Henry
at that
Todd
time?
was
I thought
teaching.
so.
He taught evidence, one of the hardest courses that we had. He was known for giving what we, as students, thought was unreasonably long assignments. Now, you remember all of us, of course, were fully employed, having to do our assignments after work and between the nights that we actually had classes, and we would all shake our heads. How are we ever going to do that? Doesn't he understand that we have?
And your days were
time.
spent, if I understand correctly, your days were spent at First American in the trust department, and then your evenings were spent at the law school.
Well, just like everyone else, I wasn't my situation was no worse than anyone else. And most of us were employed full time. Now the classes were basically 2 nights a week until we got to moot court in the 3rd year, and then that was another night. Then it became 3 nights. But yes, it was very time consuming.
Right. When did you graduate from the YMCA Night Law School, Jim?
I graduated in 1974.
Now, before I get on with your career and your practice, let's go back for just a second. While you were back in law school, did you get married?
I did. I got married in 1971. In fact, right around the time I started into law school.
And who was the bride?
I married a young lady from Nashville named Gail Hodges in November of '71.
And did you and Gail have children?
We did. We had a daughter and a son. Merrill was born in '75, and David was born in 1978.
After you graduated, I think you were already working at the trust department for First American. Did you continue there?
I did continue there for about 1.5 years. And at that time, enmeshing myself more and more in law and looking at down the road, I decided, you know, maybe I would really like to go into private practice. And I spoke with my father about the possibility of joining his firm. Of course, opportunities come up, and but they're not always there. So I think when I first mentioned it, there was no opening. But John Rowe, who is a well-known member of the bar, got his start there in my father's firm. And it was around about that time that John decided to leave and start his own law firm. So in a way, I can sort of thank John for opening up that opportunity for me.
What was the name of your dad's law firm?
Well, at that time, it was Stephenson, Lackey, and Holman, and right around the time that I came, Tom Holman left the firm and became president of First Federal Savings and Loan, which
I remember that.
was our largest client. I might also say that he was a real property instructor at the Night Law School too. But soon after Tom left, my father invited Kirk Waite and Bill Bozeman to join the firm. And at that time, the firm's name was changed to Stephenson, Lackey, and Waite. And
This would have been, I'm guessing, about 1976.
76, that's exactly right. It would have been about, I came in like, I think, around February 76, and the others, and all these changes took place, I think, during that year.
Right. Tell us a little bit about that firm. Who did what? You've mentioned some of the lawyers, but give us a little bit more insight.
Well, senior partner, J.G. Stephenson, was at that time either the oldest or certainly one of the very oldest members of the Nashville Bar Association. He was probably at that time in his late 80s. He truly didn't practice. At that point, he would come in about 10 o'clock, kind of hold court in his office, telling stories, go to lunch with us, and have a chauffeur pick him up early afternoon to drive him home. But he was a hoot. We all enjoyed all of his stories. He was just a walking dictionary, I should say encyclopedia of the history of the Nashville Bar. I wish I could have a recording of all of his stories and all of the interesting characters in the bar that he would talk about.
Then there's your dad, and what area of practice did your dad center on? Was it?
My dad was a general practitioner, but he primarily was a defense lawyer. He did a lot of insurance defense work. I think in particular at that time representing the Hartford. And then, of course, the representation of First Federal, again, our largest client. In fact, we were so closely related to them that our offices were in the First Federal building, and the back door to our offices opened up into the loan processing department of First Federal.
What about Kirk Waite? I know Kirk from years ago, but what?
Kirk is just absolutely just a prince of a guy, just an outstanding person, and just a great litigator, and fun to be around. Just very humorous, and always had some little unusual saying or something that would catch your attention. I think it was from Kirk that I first heard the answer to the question of how busy you are. And he would say, you know, busier than a one-armed paper hanger in a windstorm, or busier than the long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. That's just, I mean, he always had something, and he was just fun to be around.
You mentioned Bill Bozeman.
Bill
What did Bill
Bozeman
do?
Was a graduate of Nashville School of Law. He was 1 year ahead of me, and he and I became close friends, and are to this day. He and I worked a lot on the similar matters there in the office. But with Bill around, you always had to be very careful on April 1st, because he was the ultimate joker. We learned to be very careful in answering telephone calls, and he got me one time. He picked up the phone on April 1st, and the voice said, "This is so-and-so with the Internal Revenue Service." He said, "We've got some bad news for you, Mr. Lackey." He had me going. There would always be something that he would be pulling on April Fools. But he was a very good man, and
Did he work with the property and insurance end of their law practice?
he
there?
did. He and I sort of worked in tandem. Our law firm was heavily involved in all of the mortgage loans that First Federal made. Bill, in particular, did all the title work. I did all the loan review and instructions to the closing department as to what needed to be done in order for the bank to get a first lien on the property. And we continued that, and so yes, our practices were very similar.
Who else that I might know in the bar was a member of your firm back in the days after you had joined your dad's office?
Nancy Corley was in the firm. Now, Nancy, you've got to put this in time perspective now. I joined the firm, in 1976. Nancy had been there for a little while before that. But back in those days, there were not very many women in the Nashville Bar Association. Now, there were some, but Nancy was and is an excellent lawyer. But she has told me many times, and I will just mention this here today, of how grateful that she was to my father for hiring her, because there were law firms were not interested in hiring lady attorneys at that time.
A lot has changed.
And a lot has changed. And as those of you listening or other members of the bar that know Nancy know what a fine attorney she is, but someone just has to be given a chance.
Was Bob Lewis a member of your firm?
Bob Lewis was a member of the firm when I initially came. He left shortly afterwards. I unfortunately did not get an opportunity to spend a lot of time with him, and Jim Creasy also was there for a short time before he moved on to the state in the Attorney General's office.
Jim, at some point, you mentioned that a good part of your firm's business was at First Federal. At some point, didn't First Federal get purchased?
They did. I'm not sure the exact date. It would have been somewhere in the early 80s. They merged with Home Federal, which was another large S&L at that time. First Federal was the smaller of the two, and the Home Federal folks and the First Federal folks, well, they basically, when they came together, they created a Metropolitan Federal, who was no longer in existence either, but at that time they became quite a power in town. And as a result of that, our law firm lost the representation of the S&L, the law firm representing the other institution, which was a much larger firm, took that, which was, we all understood that. But it did hurt the firm because we had relied too much on that one very good client.
What, in the long run, about 1984, did your firm dissolve?
They did. In 1984, by this time we had moved out of that building and were in the 501 Union building. And in 1984, as you say, the firm dissolved. Everyone went a different direction. And in my case, I moved my office to Brentwood and became associated with Bill Bradley, who was also a Y Law School graduate from, he was probably 8 or 10 years older than myself. He'd been out there quite a good while. But we did not have a partnership. We were really two sole practitioners just
Sharing
expenses.
Right, right. Where were your offices then?
Our offices were off of Wilson Pike Circle on Peach Court. This was really before the Maryland Farms build up. It existed, but it really hadn't come into its own quite so much at that time.
Now, about this time, that is 1984 and 1985, I think you've told me that it was a period of a bit of personal crisis sort of in your life.
That's true, Gareth. In 1983, my mother died, and at the very end of the year, so at December actually, so that had just happened when the firm dissolved in May of '84. And around that time, my marriage was falling apart. 1985, well, we separated late in '84, divorced in July of '85, and I began thinking about maybe making another move from the practice there where I was. But let me throw in one thing. That was a little of a dark period, but I want to throw in a little light moment in that. During that period, my mother had died. My wife had gone into the hospital for some extended period, and my father had gone into the hospital for some surgery. I can't remember, I believe this was either spring of '84 or '85. And my father from the hospital said he'd like me to cover for him on a routine motion that he had in Charlotte. So I said, sure, I'll be glad to do that. Well, it so happened on that particular day, my 6-year-old son was not in school, and so I took him with me. And he had a big time. He got to sit up on the witness stand, and the judge talked to him, and he just had a great time. After it was all over with, as we were walking out through the courtroom, I noticed that David was looking to the left and looking to the right, and he had this confused expression on his face. And I said, "Well, David, what's wrong?" He said, "Well, where's the electric chair?" And the folks still in the pews there in the courtroom got a good laugh out of that. At 6 years old, I'd already seen too much TV, I suppose.
What, you said you began to kind of rethink what you needed to do career-wise. What did you decide to do, Jim?
Well, I had thrown out the possibility that I might be looking for something else because you know, as a sole practitioner, you don't have any retirement plan. You don't. You got a lot of ups and downs and income and so forth. So I thought maybe a corporate situation might be a good plan to
Yes.
to meet my needs as with a young family. And about that time, Bill Bozeman, who had now become manager of Ticor Title Insurance Company, offered me a position as claims counsel with Ticor Title Insurance. Ticor is a company that we had worked with quite a bit earlier when we represented First Federal. So I already had a good relationship with them. So I took Bill up on that offer and became, in 1988, became claims counsel for Ticor. And
What states did you cover? What was your jurisdiction? So
at that time, I covered the Tennessee and North Carolina. It was a good fit. I enjoyed that because I was able to kind of blend together the general practice experience, working with other lawyers, kind of analyzing the legal situation in these claims, and also putting together some of the title experience, even the estate experience, because you'd be surprised how many problems with the states will lend themselves to title claims.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, given the experience that you had had at your dad's firm, and then couple that with sort of the background also with wills and estates, yeah, that was a good position for you to get. What about your personal life? Did you remarry during this period when you joined Ticor?
I did. In 1987, I did get married. And let me go back and say, I mentioned to you that I divorced in 1985. And later that year, upon the recommendation of a fellow attorney who was also divorced, I decided to, in fact, several of us decided we would participate in a singles group at West End Methodist Church. And so we got together and we did that. And the very first person that I met the first night was Karen Jewett. Now, this was October of '85. Now, the nature of these groups is doing things just as a lot of single folks group things.
Sure.
And it wasn't until the next July that we actually had a date. We were just, everyone kind of just enjoys meeting different people. But so July '86, we have our first date. Later that year we get engaged. May of '87, we get married.
Now, did Karen already have children?
She did, like myself. She had been previously married and had 2 children who overlapped mine. Eric, who's born in 73, and Susan, who was born in 77. So basically, the four children were only 5 years apart from top to bottom there.
And you were, I think, you were the custodian for your children.
As it turned out, I was. So everyone lived with us. We just had a blended family, and we, in 1989, we originally lived in her house, and in 1989 we bought a house to accommodate everyone, with, which is where we still live, as a matter of fact.
Right. I think you moved to the sort of the Westmead Hillwood area.
That's correct.
Very good, Jim. How did it go, and what was the commercial environment when you joined Ticor rather, as a claims counsel?
It was just about to go downhill. The 1987, I believe it was 87, Tax Reform Act had started taking effect, and all of the tax shelters that people had been creating were beginning to fall apart. And unfortunately, there were some real estate related situations that were involved with that, where our company had agreed to insure over some existing mortgages based on taking various kinds of security. And to make a long story short, there were claims everywhere.
Sounds like a nightmare to me.
There were some major claims, just whole apartment buildings, whole condo complexes that were failing from a security standpoint, and so I did a lot of learning in those first few years. I really did.
Sounds like you were busy. Indeed, I mean, I think every lawyer who's been a lawyer for very long in Nashville remembers the Freeman and Company and all of the tax shelters that were created throughout our community, and then all of a sudden, boom, they're in trouble.
And then all the S&Ls started going down, and then we were dealing with the Resolution Trust Corp, the RTC, and yeah, that was quite a period.
But you lived through it.
Lived through it. Ticor had some problems from that, and they were weakened. And in 1991, after I had only been with them 3 years, they were taken over by Chicago Title, which also had an office here and was leading a title insurance company throughout the country. And at that time, I was fortunate to be retained by Chicago, and my responsibilities, in fact, increased, so that I was handling claims for Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Western Pennsylvania. So, and that became even more interesting, adding all these different situations in these different states.
Did you stay in the claims portion of Chicago Title?
In the mid-90s, the company made a major change on that. They decided to have the claims handled out of a major regional claims office, in our case, Atlanta. So they closed down our operation and potentially jeopardized my job.
Absolutely. This is worrisome.
I was very fortunate that our manager, Mark Turner, found a way to retain me, although not as you might have guessed. Chicago had another office in Tennessee beside Nashville, namely in Memphis, and seemed like they had lost their underwriting counsel. So Mark said, here's my proposal to you, Jim. You can become the underwriting counsel for the Memphis office. And I sort of processed that for a moment, and I said, okay, but you understand I'm not moving from Nashville. And so we worked that out, and for close to 2 years, I would commute to Memphis for several days a week. I had an office down there and an office up here, and I would do work for one office and several days a week, and for the other office the other days of the week.
Was it a big change in the type of law that you were applying to get on the business end rather than the claims end?
It was considerably. Whereas I was working with a lot of outside counsel and really not being far away from general practice litigation, now I was primarily working with title lawyers only, and both in our company and in law firms throughout the country. But it's a very big change. It was primarily analyzing and determining risks for major transactions.
Am I right that this particular period of the mid-90s was also a period of enormous growth just to the west of Memphis?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah, west, I guess east of Memphis. Did you take part in any big projects there?
I did. The biggest project that I handled during my time as underwriting counsel was in working on the development of the Wolf Chase Galleria in the Germantown area there in Memphis. That involved the primary track plus numerous out parcels that individual retailers or restaurants were purchasing, and so it was overall it was a $50 million plus development, and was quite challenging, kept me very busy.
So was your day basically consumed on a project like this with trying to figure out if these various tracts that I guess were being consolidated as a part of the Galleria and then mortgaged, that the titles were in shape and
That's right.
and were insurable?
And the work involved a lot of survey review, constantly working with surveys and determining, separating out smaller tracts from larger tracts. And in some cases there would be like a mortgage lien that would encompass everything, but you have to consider that now you're going to have a smaller tract, and you have to make sure you keep track of what obligations are on what. And then a whole series of different people you're working with. And there's a number of restaurants on the northern portion of the tract, and you're dealing with corporate counsel and for these restaurant franchises in each separate case. So you're not always dealing with the same people. It's a constant change from one group of folks to another. But it was really enjoyable. I learned a lot.
Well, that's been a very successful operation.
It's worked out very well, yes.
Yeah. Wonderful. Did you stay at the Memphis office even though you were living in Nashville, or did your job transfer back here?
Well, eventually they hired a full-time counsel down there, and I came back here, which was the only practical solution to that ultimately. Then our office moved from downtown Nashville out to a new office in Cool Springs because really our business didn't need to be downtown. We serviced quite a few attorney agents. It was easier for them to visit us in the suburbs. We did not need to be at the courthouse because even by this time, in the early 2000s, title searching could be done online. So that move was made. It was a successful move for the company, and but things were growing in Nashville. There's plenty of work for me as an additional underwriting counsel. And I'll mention the folks that I work with. Joe Pitt was a state counsel, one of the best title attorneys you'll find anywhere. I learned a great deal from him. And Yale Riley, who was a younger lawyer in the office. Yale primarily worked with the attorney agents. I primarily worked on commercial transactions, and Joe did it all and made sure Yale and I were in line. So my role really was, I was really working on these commercial transactions, generally $2 or $3 to $20 million deals. Nothing like that wolf chase, but still some of them could be challenging. And in many cases, I would work with what we call our national business units. We had several major cities in the country that would generate deals all over the country, and we may get a deal from one of our so-called NBUs. We might have 20 sites all over Middle Tennessee, and so we would be coordinating all of these at the same time. So it could be sort of challenging from just a management aspect.
Jim, how long did you stay with your work at Chicago Title? I think you've retired now. When was that?
I retired in January of 2010, completing about 22 years with the title company. At the time, I was 66 years old.
Now, there would be some people who would say, Jim, isn't that a little bit early to retire? What were your thoughts?
Well, I constantly get that, particularly from members of the bar who don't ever seem to want to give it up. And I tell them what I had told you earlier, which is that seeing my father retire at 71 and not making it to his 72nd birthday, that at that point I made the vow that I was going to retire early enough so that I could actually enjoy my retirement.
That makes a lot of sense, especially because of what I'm going to ask you, and that is, if you don't mind, bring us up to date about your children, that is two of your parents, and then grandchildren.
I'll be glad to. Now those 4 children are in their late 30s, early 40s, and I'm proud to say that we raised them all as our children, not my children and her children. And they developed that relationship, and to this day are all very close. You know, we do things, vacations together, all celebrate each other's occasions. At this time, Eric is 44, lives in Seattle, was with Microsoft for about 10 years. A couple of years ago, left there with some other Microsoft alums and on a startup company that's now got over 100 employees. And he's married, has a young son that's about 9 months old. And one of our chief travel destinations during retirement is making those annual or more trips to Seattle. Now
Absolutely.
the next in line, age-wise, is my daughter Meryl, who lives here in Nashville. She works for I would say ADT. They actually, through corporate changes, have a different name now, but she's a trainer. She works out of her home, and her job is to, she goes all over the southeast and northeast to commercial clients, and trains their employees on how to use their corporate security systems.
Right.
So she is out of town all the time doing that. She is married, has no children at this time. Next child is Susan. She is married. Has 2 little girls, 4.5 and 7, and she and her husband live in Williamson County in Brentwood, just a couple of miles from my other daughter, by the way, who see each other all the time. Susan and Eric, both, by the way, got their MBAs from Vanderbilt Owen Graduate School of Management, and Susan works for Bank of America in Charlotte, but works out of her home in Nashville as a project manager. But in addition to that, she and her first husband started a business in Wilmington, North Carolina, a franchise of Massage Envy, which they're actually now selling, and she and her current husband, Kurt Weil, have just opening up another business of their own in Franklin, waxing the city. We in fact have their grand opening next month, so a little plug for her. And then David, the youngest, is not married at this time, but he's divorced last year. But he has a 5-year-old son that is just the most fun little guy in the world to have around. David works for DSI in a lab environment. So we enjoy all of them and like to spend time with them as much as we can.
Boy, you do. There's just nothing like grandchildren to have fun. You know, what have you and Karen been doing? Have you traveled some? Or I know that you attend St. George's Church.
We do. We spend a lot of time on activities there at church. They have a very active seniors program there, and we're very involved in participating in that, and Karen in particular is involved in organizing a number of those activities. They have numerous little travel bus trips that we've been on a number of, and we've other travel too. We've have been to Europe, and Alaska cruise, Virgin Islands, Florida a number of times. But we always enjoy being back here, and we just enjoy being with the grandchildren. And one thing we like to do is just little day ventures out to small towns in Middle Tennessee. We have lunch at interesting restaurants, then back home for that evening.
This has been fascinating, and especially so since it involves areas of practice that I really don't know a lot about. You have any thoughts, Jim, that you wanted to share about either practice in general or the real estate slash real estate insurance business changes
Well,
that you've noticed?
The certainly changes in the bar. When I can remember the bar in '74, I had mentioned before there weren't very many women in the bar. That's one of the biggest changes. Is that I think there just must be as many women as there are men at the bar now, and it's why not? I mean, it's a great opportunity for women in law. But also, Nashville was a lot smaller then. It seemed like the field of law was kind of like a very large fraternity. Everyone seemed to know everybody. Now, I didn't as a young attorney, but I knew quite a few, and there was just sort of a collegial atmosphere, and certainly a lot of that now, but the bar is so big, it's hard for that to be quite as true. Yeah.
What about something that I wanted to mention before we stop, and that is the pride I'm imagining you feel in your family's association over the years with the YMCA Night Law School, and the fact that you've been a part of that and a part of the Nashville practice for so long.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Nashville School of Law for giving me the opportunity that I had to get my law education, and I just think the institution serves this wonderful purpose of giving people at any point in their life an opportunity to get a law degree. I can't say enough good things about it. There's so many good people that have been there and continue to be. Joe Loser did a wonderful job after my father left the deanship, and he was a great friend of the school during the time that he was there. And it's under great leadership now with Judge Koch. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, Bill Koch.
So I think the future is really great for that.
I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this. I really can't. Thanks so much for giving your time to help keep up with the history of the Nashville Bar, Jim. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Jim, before we close up and head for home, you mentioned to me that there was a reflection that you wanted to share about your dad.
Well, I think anything I might have to say about the law would not be complete without saying the influence that my father has had on that. When I was growing up, I knew that my dad was a lawyer. I didn't really appreciate the significance of that until I became a lawyer. And the years that I practiced with him made me realize what a real lawyer was all about. He was a lawyer's lawyer, but what I particularly remember and want to emphasize is he, to me, set the standard in terms of honesty and integrity in the law. And anyone that did work with him in the law firm would say the same thing. I particularly recall an incident where as dean of the school, he had a visitor from the father of a student who was not going to graduate. And this father, who was a lawyer in a town south of Nashville, came into the office, pleaded with my father to find a way for his son to graduate, and ultimately offered to make a large contribution to the school in order to help get that done. Well, everyone in the office to this day will remember that occasion. My father just literally blew up. He just, at the top of his lungs, shouted this man down. "You're trying to bribe me?" The whole office came to a standstill. You could have heard a pin drop outside of that one conversation. He was just outraged, and summarily dismissed that very fine senior lawyer from the office. And it just illustrated to me that there were no circumstances that would or could sway a lawyer from the integrity that we all try to uphold as members of the bar. So that was an example for all of us in the office.
You know, I know because I practiced for a while with your dad's peers at John Hooker Sr.'s old firm, Hooker, Keeble, Dodson, and Harris, that their view about your dad was one of the highest respect. And I appreciate your adding that because I think it needs to be said. Anything further, Jim?
I believe that's it.
Thank you again.
Okay.
Take care.